This game was played between Jaan Eslon, with white, and Mikhail Tal, with black, at Sevilla Open Tournament, 1992. Jaan Eslon opens with pawn to d4. Mikhail Tal moves the knight to f6. If you like the games of legendary Mikhail Tal and want to watch them, you please subscribe to this channel. There is a dedicated playlist for you, containing more such games, played by Mikhail Tal. White pawn moves to c4. Black pawn moves to e6. Entering into the queen's gambit declined. White knight moves to f3. Black pawn moves to d5, gaining central space. If you are interested in such games played by the other chess legends also, you may visit the channel. White knight moves to c3. Black pawn captures on c4, gaining material advantage but isolating the pawn, destroying the position. White queen moves to a4, checking the king and forking the pawn on c4. Black knight moves from b file to d7, blocking the check. White pawn moves to e4, gaining both the vital central squares. Black pawn moves to c5, trying to trade the pawns to destroy white's structure. White bishop captures pawn on c4, taking the undefended pawn. Black pawn captures pawn on d4, destroying white's structure. White knight captures pawn on d4, centralizing the knight. Black bishop moves to c5, attacking the knight and looking for a vital diagonal. White knight moves to b3, trying to capture the vital dark squared bishop. Black bishop moves to d6, seeking safety. White bishop moves to e2, eyeing for two diagonals. Black castles kingside, seeking king's safety. White bishop moves to e3, completing minor piece development, allowing the king to castle both kingside or queenside. Black queen moves to e7, developing the queen. White castles kingside. Black knight moves to e5, positioning the knight in one of the most active squares. White pawn moves to h3, gaining space on the kingside. Black bishop moves to d7, attacking the queen and completing minor piece development. White queen moves to d4, centralizing the queen. Black knight moves to c6, attacking the queen. White queen drops back to d1. Black rook moves to d8, in a semi-open file, trying to put pressure on white. White pawn moves to f4, gaining space on the king side and threatening a fork. Black pawn moves to e5, stopping the fork but allowing white to trade the pawns and get an open file for white rook. White pawn moves to f5, gaining more space in kingside and stopping black to access the bishop pair smoothly. White has gained a lot of space but its king is unsafe, creating endgame threats. On the contrary, black is having less space than white but its king is a lot safer. Black knight moves to d4, offering a trade of bishop or knight for a knight. White agrees with knight trade and captures on d4, trying to gain material advantage on next move. Black pawn captures knight on d4, forking the knight and bishop. White bishop captures pawn on d4, putting pressure on black knight. Black bishop moves to c6, putting pressure on e4 pawn. White knight moves to d5, offering a trade. Black bishop captures knight on d5. White pawn captures bishop on d5. Black knight captures pawn on d5, equalizing the materials. White queen moves to e1, supporting the bishop. Black knight moves to e3, attacking the rook on f1. White pawn moves to f6, forcing the queen to move. Black queen moves to e4 to attack the bishop and threatening mate in 1. White bishop captures knight on e3, a forced move to survive. Black queen captures bishop on e3, checking the king. White king moves to h1, to find safety. Black queen moves to e5, threatening mate in 1. White pawn moves to g3, blocking the mate. Black rook moves to e8, building pressure on white's light squared bishop. White bishop moves to f3, offering a queen trade. Black queen captures the free pawn on f6. Black gets a discovered attack on white's queen. White queen moves to f2, supporting the bishop and putting pressure on black. Black rook moves to e7, trying to double the rooks on open e-file. White rook on a file moves to e1, offering to trade the rooks. Black rook captures rook on e1, allowing white to capture the rook and get a super strong open file. White rook captures rook on e1. Black rook moves to d8. White king moves to g2, bringing up the king and strengthening defense. Black pawn moves to b6, solidifying the position and stopping white from capturing any of the pawns. White rook moves to e2, supporting the b2 pawn. Black bishop moves to c5, attacking the queen and forcing it to move from the vital f2 square. White queen moves to e1, trying to trade the rooks by forking the rook and the king by giving check. Black pawn moves to g6, making room for the king. White rook moves to e8, giving check, offering a trade of rooks. Black rook captures rook on e8. White queen captures rook on e8, giving check, forcing the king to move to g7. Black king moves to g7, a better move than blocking the check with bishop. White pawn moves to b3, pushing the queenside pawns. Black queen moves to d4, threatening mate in 1. White queen moves to e1, stopping the mate. Black pawn moves to f5, creating counterplay on the kingside. White pawn moves to h4, stopping black's g-pawn to move forward. Black pawn moves to h6, pushing the pawn. White king moves to h2, seeking safety. Black pawn moves to g5, offering a trade of pawns. White pawn captures pawn on g5, allows black to capture the pawn and gain more space. Black pawn captures pawn on g5, simplifying position. White queen moves to d1, offering a trade of queens. Black queen moves to f2, checking, forcing white to stop the check with the bishop. White bishop moves to g2, blocking the check. Black king moves to g6, bringing up the king. White pawn moves to b4, sacrificing a pawn to divert the bishop from the crucial diagonal. Black bishop moves to d4, denying to accept the sacrificed pawn. White queen moves to f1, again offering a trade of queens. Black queen moves to e3, denying to trade queens. White pawn moves to g4, giving up a pawn. Black pawn captures the free pawn on g4. White queen moves to b1, checking the king and hoping for a perpetual check later. Black king moves to g7, avoiding perpetual check. White queen moves to f1, cutting off the king. Black bishop moves to e5, checking, forcing white to pull back the king. White king moves to h1, a forced move. Black bishop moves to g3, putting more pressure on white. Jaan Eslon resigns. Mikhail Tal wins. Eslon's aggressive pawn pushes, especially the f4-f5 advance, aimed to seize the initiative but inadvertently weakened his kingside defenses. Tal capitalized on these weaknesses by activating his queen and bishop for a potent attack. Tal's sharp tactical vision uncovered vulnerabilities in Eslon's position, particularly after the exchange of knights and queens, when black's pieces became very active. Eslon's position started to crumble under precise pressure. Tal coordinated his pieces efficiently, controlling critical squares and open files, especially in the late middle game and endgame. This coordination allowed Tal to launch decisive threats that Eslon struggled to parry. Though Eslon could hold the position till move 35, he then blundered on move 45 by giving up the g3 pawn by pushing it forward, allowing Tal to gain the advantage of 2 extra pawns in the queen-bishop endgame. In this position Tal was better not only in material advantage but also in positional structure in spite of his double pawns on g-file, as Eslon had 2 isolated pawns, leading to a worse position than Tal in the endgame. The culminating move by Tal demonstrates that Eslon's defenses were finally overwhelmed, forcing resignation. In summary, Eslon lost because Tal skillfully exploited weaknesses created by Eslon's ambitious play, showcased superior tactical skills, and transformed a complex position into a winning attack. This game exemplifies how even strong players can be undone by the relentless creativity and precision of a player like Mikhail Tal. Please subscribe to the channel and like the video if you enjoy it. Thank you for watching.